Yesterday, I shared part one of the story of my spiritual journey at the request of our friend, Retirement Mantra. I'll put a link to part one in the description. I ended at my happiness hypothesis, where, aged 21, coming down after a rave, I asked a question that would change the course of my life forever. If I can be that happy with drugs in my system, I asked, could I be that happy without drugs in my system? This hypothesis took a long time to prove. I did perform some early research during which I confirmed that Buddhist monks were probably the happiest people on the planet. And this fascinated me because they were achieving that status while living extremely simply. So I was intrigued, but as I mentioned in part one, the internet then wasn't what it is now. I don't remember how hard I looked. I suspect I could have looked harder, but I didn't find much inspiration to pursue any spiritual practice myself at that time. In fact, my impression was that what the monks were doing was for the monastery, and I had no desire to go into one myself. I spent the whole of my 20s hauling drum kits in and out of vans, driving thousands of miles across the UK, performing music I didn't like. And though I was developing great skill, I ended up one of the best players in the UK, I was often working for less than minimum wage. The hours were long and unsociable, and my total income varied wildly from month to month. And though my teenage ambition to perform with my musical heroes carried me through my early 20s, the longer I went on in that career, the clearer it became to me that it wasn't going to happen. I didn't know why it wasn't happening. I assumed I just wasn't good enough. If anyone had told me about the necessity of marketing, making people aware of what I offered, then things might have turned out differently. And that would have been an even greater tragedy because I'd never have discovered what came next. Amidst all this, I was in acute, chronic physical pain. I spent 10 whole years with my upper back on fire. If you'd known me at that time, you'd have seen me performing stretches mid-conversation every time we met. But they didn't help. The pain was at its worst during and after performances, but it never subsided. I woke up in the morning in pain, and I went to bed in pain. I was also beginning to acknowledge the appropriateness of the labels stress and anxiety for what my inner world was like. I was constantly replaying the past and wishing it were different. I was constantly visualizing the future and obsessing over how to get it right. Beginning to acknowledge how awful all of this was, I started to experiment with guided meditations here and there. They were not the magic bullet I was hoping for, but I did experience subtle reductions to my inner turmoil. In 2015, my best friend from school got married in Thailand. I was desperately stressed about finding the money to attend, but I made it. and I was hopeful about what would happen to me, because this trip represented the longest I'd been away from a drum kit since 1998. Surely, I thought, 2 weeks of rest will heal me. But I was shocked to find, arriving home, that I was in just as much pain as when I left. I became more desperate than ever. I couldn't continue as I was. Something had to change. So, although I was broke after my trip, I made myself even more broke by beginning a course of treatment with a chiropractor. This chiropractor told me something that would change the course of my life forever. There's nothing wrong with your spine, she said. It's what you're doing with it that's causing you all this pain. That was a paradigm shift, a moment beyond which things would never look the same again. I'd never considered the possibility that I was doing anything with my spine. I was a drummer playing the drums, and drummers often have hurty backs. I studied technique as far as what I was doing with my sticks. But despite 6 years of formal lessons, despite hanging out with hundreds of other drummers and thousands of hours of studying the greats, I never encountered any advice regarding what I should or shouldn't be doing with my spine. My chiropractor recommended I explore something called Alexander technique. And that's a deep, deep rabbit hole. But to give you the tiniest nutshell of what it's about, my incredibly skilled Alexander technique teachers taught me over 5 years how to stop doing all the stuff that was causing me so much pain. And this turned out to be not about stretching or strengthening, but about mental discipline. That mental discipline served me in many ways. One of the most important things it changed was my tendency to procrastinate. And one of the things I'd been procrastinating over was listening to more Alan Watts. I'd heard a few of Alan's talks, and I felt like there was something valuable for me in his words. But like so many of us in the 21st century, I procrastinated. Not only did I choose to party, doom scroll, and play video games instead, but even when I was somewhat inclined to listen to Alan's work, I encountered inner resistance. Perhaps on some level, I knew his ideas would change me. And like most people, I was afraid of change back then. I spent 6 months listening to everything I could get my hands on from Alan. I was obsessed, and my worldview changed many times over. When I'd devoured all of Alan's material, I spent my next 6 months with Ram Dass. Alan had worked on my mind. Ram Dass worked on my heart. I spent more and more time in solitude as I began reconsidering everything I thought I knew about myself, the world, and other people. I sampled other great teachers through this time too. Ram Dass put me on to Ramana Maharshi. Ramana Maharshi led me to Rupert Spira. Rupert Spira led me to Eckhart Tolle. Then I found Mooji, Osho, Adyashanti, Thich Nhat Hanh, Jack Cornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Shinzen Young, Chula Dasa. I continued to experiment with guided meditations and experienced marginal improvements to my state of being while sitting, but immediately following a practice, I went right back to tormenting myself. But I was also starting to get involved in online communities. I most often visited the Stream Entry subreddit. And soon I began to hear that it would be wise to make contact with a teacher for direct guidance. Someone on that subreddit posted that their teacher was accepting new students. This teacher, named Dhammarato, had lived as a Theravada Buddhist monk in Thailand for 8 years, but then he'd been sent out of the monastery to teach online. I was skeptical. Buddhism's pretty hardcore, I commented, not sure I have time for reading sutras and meditating hours each day. It's not like that, replied this Redditor. It's like talking to your grandpa, just call him. The first time I called Dhammarato, we spoke for 3 whole hours. I called right back the next day and we spoke for 3 hours more. To say he was generous with his time would be an enormous understatement. I offered donations, but he wouldn't take them. The most I was ever able to give him was a box of tea bags, which I took with me from England when I visited. When I spoke with Dhammarato, I felt I was hearing what I'd needed to hear when I was a little boy trying to make sense of myself and the world around me. 26 years I'd waited, not knowing what I was waiting for. Now it was clear. What I'd been waiting for was Dharma. Dharma is a word that has no single equivalent in English. It means truth, wisdom, teaching, purpose, order, support, virtue, and essence. What it meant to me at that pivotal time of introduction was that the impression of the world that I'd had since childhood, the deep feeling that it and its inhabitants basically had everything back to front, that these impressions were after all correct. And so began the letting go of all the compromises I'd made in my attempts to fit in and play along. Dhammarato taught me how the mind itself creates stress, anxiety, dissatisfaction. He taught me how happiness really works and, of course, how to get it. He taught me not only how to meditate properly without guided tracks, but how to make meditation around-the-clock practice. All my study of all the skills I'd learned previously had prepared me for this undertaking. I launched into the practice of Anapanasati, the Buddha's original method for training the mind, and I launched into it head first. Very quickly, every moment of my life became about observing my mind and applying the wisdom I was learning as I spoke with Dhammarato at least twice per week. We went deep into the Buddha's teachings, referencing the oldest recorded texts, and we applied those teachings to the actual stuff of my life. We covered work, rest, relationships, thinking, learning, habits, responsibility, compassion, speech, desire, aversion, judgment, stress, anxiety, and much, much more. We shone the light of wisdom on everything I could think to bring to those calls. I learned the wisdom of impermanence, of interdependence and of no self. But like every other practitioner who ever lived, my path was not linear. Some days I would call Dhammarato with a big grin on my face. Everything's actually okay. I really don't have to suffer. Only to call back the next day and insist that my problems had the power to make me feel bad. This was effectively a 2-year Buddhist boot camp. I deprioritized everything else in my life. I broke up with my girlfriend of 7 years. I did as little work as I could do to get by. I stopped seeing family. I stopped seeing friends. I'd enrolled to train as a teacher in Alexander technique at great cost, and that was bringing wonderful results, but I put even that in second place. I was determined, like the Buddha himself was, to solve the problem of the human condition. Late in 2017, about 18 months into my work with Dhammarato, my mother attempted suicide. She'd battled depression her whole life, but she'd managed to hide it from me and my sister fairly well, leveraging the fact that we didn't know what to look for anyway. Mental health awareness has come a long way. I remember the moment I heard about my mum's attempt to take her life. It was a test of everything I'd been learning and practicing. My brother-in-law called me, told me he'd broken down Mum's door to find her on her bed, surrounded by empty pill bottles, clutching a note. A wave of electricity erupted from my gut up to my throat. But as it did, I just watched. And I, as the watcher, remained calm. This was actually quite unsettling. Had I turned myself into some kind of unfeeling Dharma zombie? Well, no. Because I was feeling stuff. I was just okay with feeling it. And the next thing I felt was strong compassion. I sprinted to my car and sped to the hospital. And when I found her, I knelt down beside my mother, who was conscious following a stomach pump. And I said to her, "You're going to be okay. I'm going to take care of you." I would not have considered making this promise had I not been learning to take such good care of myself. I didn't know how my mother would respond to the Dharma, but I knew that sharing it with her was what I was going to do. That became my first teaching experience, and it's where I'll begin the next part of my story tomorrow. If you want to catch that video, do all the stuff that tells YouTube that you want to see it, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you want to know where you're at in your spiritual journey, take my 1-minute quiz. There's a link in the description. As always, I hope to see you here again tomorrow.